Hi, everyone. I'd like to call this Budget Development Committee meeting to order. I'd like to have our acknowledge the traditional lands.
The land upon which we work, live, and sustain ourselves is the ancestral and treaty lands of the Michizagig Anishinaabe, also known today as the Mississaugas of the Credit, the rightful caretakers and title holders of this land. We also recognize the rich pre-contact history and relationships which include the Anishinaabe and the Ongwe Hongwe.
Since European contact, this land continues to be home to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. As responsible community members, we value the diversity, dignity, and worth of all people.
Colonialism displaced and dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their ancestral land
and continues to deny their basic human rights, dignities, and freedoms.
We are committed to learning true history to reconcile, make reparations, and fulfill our treaty obligations to the original peoples and our collective responsibilities to the lands, water, animals, and each other for future generations.
Thank you for explaining that. We'll move now on to approval of the agenda. We have no modification updates. So do I have someone who wants to put it on the floor? Trustee Benjamin, seconded by Trustee Bailey. All those in favor for the agenda? So carried. So anyone have a declarations of conflict of interest here in the meeting? Seeing none, we're going to go to approval of the minutes. So from our meeting of May 7th, I'd like Trustee Johal, would you put that on the floor?
Yes,
thank you. And Trustee Cole, who's online, to second that. So all those in favor, or unless there's any questions or comments about no comments? Seeing none, all those in favor of the minutes from last meeting? Okay, so carried. So we're going to jump right into, we just have one staff report today, but it's a lot of meat, right? A lot of money, for sure. So we're going to have the understanding of core education funding and high-level ministry announcement and changes. Basically, the change in the way the funding has been enveloped and presented. And it'll be presented here by Tanya Alicia Charles. I'll turn it over to you. And you have a PowerPoint you'd like to show? Yes, Lorraine.
Thank you, through you, Chair. So if you recall, at the last Budget Development Committee meeting, we went through the core education funding as now was just announced, and we went through kind of high level as to the different allocations. And so I'll first do a reminder before we go to a deep dive of the numbers. So the first slide will really show, hopefully you also have this in an electronic version, but the first slide really shows sort of what are the key changes or the main changes from what was used to be grants for student needs to core education funding, and what are the changes for this year, kind of on a high level basis. So first of all, as a reminder, one of the intents of the ministry to change it to core education funding was in their view to create greater transparency and accountability. So again, there's more transparency to come, because apparently through these changes, there will be a requirement that all boards post information on their website that the ministry will provide that will actually allow community members, parents to compare board over board in these new kind of buckets that they've created. So that's kind of part of the transparency and accountability that they've built in. So that's one of the areas. The other thing that in order to do this, what they've done is sort of they've realigned a lot of the grants and changed the terminology. And so we used to have 18 grants, and they've gone down to what they call 6 funding pillars. Yeah, it still remains to see whether it's easier to understand, but obviously since this is a transition year, it's a little bit confusing. So we will be focusing on talking with the new model and the new lingo, but I will give you the next slide a little bit more understanding sort of what they've done. But that was in a view to simplification. As a reminder, as always, enrollment still is the main driver in the new funding as well. And as a reminder, enrollment is really what we call ADE, so it's a 2 count date, so not just enrollment, but actual ADE. The other main change, which was been long awaited, is updating of the census data. So there's been a few grants, so there's not just one, but there's several grants within the old funding and in this one as well that use census data. And some of them range from 2006 to 2016. All of those have been updated to use 2021 census data. However, as mentioned last time, and with a lot of the things the ministry does, it's a 5-year phase in. So for the ministry, it ensures that no board is impacted significantly in 1 year. So it's a 5-year phase in. So by the time the 5 years rolls around, probably time for another census. Again, we had hopes that this change would provide benefit to us. We're still not sure that it does. So because in doing that, one of the things they've also done is change some of the elements that are being used in the census data. So now the demographic needs, which is one of the allocations within the funding, is now only calculated using low household income as a measure. In the past, they used actually 4 elements, which was low income, recent immigrant, low parental education, lone parent status. So there was 4 variables. Now there's only 1. I don't know if they haven't explained why, but perhaps they view that low income is speaks to some of those other variables. But through that, you'll see with the numbers, it seems to have impacted us negatively. And again, I'm only going to hazard a guess, so don't hold me to it, but it could well be that again, being in the GTA, overall, we're not in a lower income compared to other areas. I don't know, but that would be. But you'll see by the numbers, it seems to have impacted us negatively. Again, the other thing that, as we'll go through the presentation, when we just start going through the numbers, there is provisions, as there always is when there's collective agreements. There's a change year over year. So you will notice that, again, there'll be a lot of changes in the numbers, which on the one hand seems good, but on the other hand, a lot of these are updates for collective agreement increases. So right now, even though some of the collective agreements have not been settled, there's what they call placeholders or provisions put in place to allocate 1.25% for agreements that have not been settled. And again, that doesn't mean the agreements will be settled at 1.25, but at this point, that's what they provided. So again, when we were talking about benchmarks and they've increased and it's 1.25%, that's simply a placeholder. But like anything in collective agreements, those are kind of a flow through. So anything that we have to do from a collective agreement perspective in terms of salary increases, if they do get implemented, we do have to flow that to the individuals. So again, you'll see changes related to that. Again, this year they have transferred some funding from what was previously called PPF, it's now called Responsive Education Programs. Those are sometimes when we get funded outside the core education funding, and now that's been put within core ed. That's not really an increase. That's a change to how it's flowing to us. There's been some changes to the transportation formula. Again, last year was the first year of the new formula, and there was a lot of feedback from the boards that some things were not exactly as they should be, and one thing that was missed was special purpose vehicles such as vans, and so they have now included that and made some other minor adjustments in the transportation formula. At the same time, they have also removed the COVID-related funding. The one that was remaining was a Safe and Clean School Supplement. And then lastly, another main change is that for non-staffing benchmarks in school operations, then that's for our facility. They have allocated about 2% as a managing commodity prices. So again, it doesn't mean that that's enough, but that's what they've given us, and that's for things like electricity, gas, and insurance, things like that. So those are the main changes. I'm going to now, I mentioned how they have reallocated the grants. I wanted to show this model only because as we're going through, as Copter is going to be showing the more detailed numbers, I wanted to get a sense or feel around why sometimes there's repetition in language. So again, on the left in the blue box, this was the former GSN grants. You may recall, again, that's not the full, it said there used to be 18 blue, and there would have been, and now there's 6 green, but I just want to give you a little bit of an example. So again, we used to have people foundation, school foundation, let's say language, and Indigenous. Within each of these components, there could have been a teacher component and sort of other components. The way the core ed funding works is the ministry has decided that anything that's like directly in classroom. So, so that would be sort of teachers and let's say ECEs. Those would be classroom staff funding, and they have stripped out anything that's sort of peripheral. It could be still be in the classroom, but it's more peripheral, like supplies or technology. Potentially technicians that support the technology or paraprofessionals. They've stripped those out and put those in what they call Learning Resource Fund. So if you can imagine, almost all the funds we used to have, they sort of split. So when we're going through the information that Connor is going to present, you will sometimes see, like classrooms staffing, or people, sorry, foundation mentioned twice, or even the Indigenous education grant mentioned twice. And that's because, again, there's a teacher component to it as well as a non-teacher component. So we're going to get used to it, but that's kind of how they split. So it's not, it seemed like they made it easier on one hand, but what they've done is simply kind of create subheadings and redivided the blue boxes. Again, just a reminder on how our formulas work, because, and I know we use a lot of this language and so most of the core ed, most of the core ed is based on formula, and all as we mentioned before, all these formulas or most of these formulas are enrollment based. And so some of the formulas, again, we won't be talking in depth about the formulas, but in case we mention certain things, you'll know what we're referencing. Some of the formulas, we need to calculate the class size. So for example, when you're looking at classrooms, it's based on class size, and that then derives the amount of teachers, which we then use a benchmark for salary. So benchmarks really talk about the dollars that the ministry has allocated for a specific type of cost. So let's say in terms of teachers, that will give us what they call a benchmark for salary. And when we say that benchmarks are increased, that means that they, for example, for salary would have added, let's say 1.25 for the collective agreement to be the new benchmark. So when benchmarks change, they usually change for things like that. In school operations, they would change for things like the 2%. So again, generally the factors on the left are things that are multiplied by the benchmark, and that's how we get our funding for a lot of the different areas. And you can see a lot of them on the left are enrollment based. So for example, entry to Canada, we would have to know how many students have entered into Canada and multiply it by the appropriate benchmark. In terms of when we go to the school type grants, in terms of P's and VPs, we need to know actually how many students are in the school. And same thing in terms of square footage for custodians, same thing, we need to know how many students are in a specific school. Other types of things that the ministry makes us look at is some grants are based on table amounts. So they allocate X amount across the province, and then they give us an allocation from that. In the administrative areas, again, some things are based on T4s, and let's say in transportation, some things are based on routing. So this is just gives everybody kind of a reminder how some of the formulas work. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Copper, who's going to go through the numbers and all the weighted numbers. And go ahead.
So thank you, Tanya, and good evening, everyone. I will walk you through the 6 funding pillars and the allocations under each of this funding, as well as the changes that happened between this year, the 23-24, and going into the 23-24 going into the 24-25 school year. So first, I'm sharing on the screen, you can see the summary of changes. I feel I hope everybody can see it. But it's a lot of numbers and a lot of colors. So I'll take a minute here to show you how the columns and the rows work. So first of all, we see this is the summary of the core ed. So this is the first year of the core ed, but what we have done is we've converted the 23-24 budget into the new format so that we are able to do the comparison between last year and this year. So the first column will just speak to the different line items in the core ed education. The next columns would show the budget amounts for 23-24 for the first column. The next column is going into the next year, 24-25. The column which has like a yellow heading, this is the budget change. So basically from this year into next year, what's the change gonna be? And the last two columns, I would speak in terms of what does what do the changes represent? What are the causes for the change? So that being said, we can move to the first line item. First of all, as Tanya mentioned, enrollment is a big driver of the funding. So let's take a look at the enrollment numbers, which our colleagues have shared in the last budget development committee. But just a reminder, so if you look at the enrollment, which is the average daily enrollment, we've seen that it has from this year to last year, the average daily enrollment has gone down. And overall it has gone down by 1,800 students. So it was 148,000 students in 23-24. And going into next year, we're expecting a decline of 1,800 students. And the next two lines show the split between elementary and secondary. So in both panels, we do expect enrollment going down. So as Tanya mentioned, like enrollment going down, we would expect our funding to go down too. And this is what we're going to be looking at, how the change in enrollment has been impacting each of the funding. So let's start with the classroom staffing fund, which is one of the biggest funding. It accounts for about 58% of the total core education funding. So the classroom staffing funding, just a reminder, this would represent all the staffing costs inside the classroom. So whoever deals with the students directly in the classroom, mostly our teachers, ECEs, EAs, etc. So the first item under the classroom staffing fund is the per pupil amount. So the first allocation is like a general amount given per grade. So the per pupil funding here is per the grade, and it also has an element of the class size. So for each of the grades, we have a class size that we have to abide to, and depending on the class size, the ministry will fund the staffing, like the number of teachers for each grade. And once the number of staffing is determined, then we multiply this by the benchmark, like how much the ministry gonna give us for each of those grades. So if we look at the per pupil amount for this year, the amount is 760.5 million. And if we look at next year, we also see that it's 760.5 million. So then when we look at the budget change, it only changed by 3,700. So you think like, oh, something kind of weird here, because with enrollment going down, we would expect the funding to go down. So that's why I have the two last columns to explain what really happened behind the 3,700. So the last two columns, the reason for the change, the first column is the enrollment change. This is the change because of enrollment, right? Because enrollment is going down by 1,800 students. So then the ministry is like, okay, like you need less teachers because you have less students. So that correspondingly, the funding goes down. So this is what this column shows, the enrollment changes, the change in funding because of the change in enrollment. And this translates into $9.8 million. The compensation change, like Tanya mentioned with the collective agreements, some of them have signed, some of them have not. But for those that have not, the ministry also wants us to have a placeholder, a provision of 1.25. So when we factor in the change in the rates, the quality of the compensation, so that actually brings us the amount that we'll eventually have to pay to the staff of 9.8 million. So that's why you see that the change is very small, but really the funding itself, like in terms of additional money or new money, in that perspective, there's no new money because in fact, from the enrollment change, the funding is going down. And the compensation change, this is money in and out. It's money that we're getting, but we have to pay the staff accordingly. Moving on to the language classroom staffing allocation. So this is a question. Was there a question?
No questions.
So moving on to the language classroom staffing allocation. So as the name implies, this is for the language instruction inside the classroom. And here we have the French as a second language and also the English as a second language. In this allocation, the funding in 23-24 was 70 million and close to 71 million. And going into next year, 24-25, it's expected to be 79 million. So in this case, we can see a budget change of 8 million. So going on the far right to see what has caused the change in the language classroom staffing allocation. So the first column shows the enrollment change of 7 million and the compensation change of 800,000. So just as a reminder, the language classroom, the FSL depends on the enrollment of our students in the French courses and for elementary depending on enrollment. And in terms of our secondary, we did see a few enrollment going up in terms of the credits, which has increased the FSL a little bit. In terms of the ESL, what we've seen is that if you remember, this funding is for recent immigrants, and we did see like the immigration picking up from the COVID. This is what we've seen in 23-24, so that's why we have an increase in enrollment here. And just a note here in terms of the DEL funding or for the students who are not immigrants but born in Canada, but whose first language is not the English nor French. This allocation has been updated with the census, and as Tanya mentioned earlier, unfortunately, we haven't seen an increase in that funding. We actually saw a decrease in that funding. In this particular one here, it was $82,000. Moving on to the next funding, which is the local circumstances staffing allocation. So here what we have is the qualification and experience for our teachers and ACEs. And we also have the funding for the trust benefit. So in the first one, the per pupil amount, we have the basic funding for the teachers, which is about $82,000. But then depending on the qualification and experience of the staff, that could translate into a higher or lower, higher amount, and that would be different from one board to the other, depending on the population of the teachers. So this is what this funding is for, is to chop up the salary of our teachers and ECEs. And as I mentioned, we also have in here the ELHD or the trust fund benefits, which you see we have had additional funding based on the collective agreement. So if we look at the numbers, we can see that in the current year, the funding was 192 million. Going into next year, we're expecting 195 million, a change of 2.8 million. And if we look at the split, because of enrollment going down, so lesser teachers is being funded, so no top up for those teachers. So from one year to the other, we see a decrease of 2.4 million, whereas under the compensation change, we see 5 million increase. That would include both the salaries and the trust benefit increase. In the Indigenous education classroom staffing allocation, this is actually a small amount here because it's only for the instruction in the classroom. And in terms of changes, that's not the big change. And mostly it's just because of a slight decrease in enrollment and the corresponding increase in benchmark. The supplementary staffing allocation. So this funding is also for staffing who deal directly with our students, but they might not be teachers. They're just additional support that we need in the classroom. And one of the big elements here is the demographic amount. With the census change, what we've seen is a decrease in the funding of $1.3 million. And the other decrease here that we've seen is for the safe and clean supplemental, the COVID funding that we got, about $832,000. So between the two of them, between the demographic and offset by any increase in benchmarks, we can see that this funding in terms of compensation has decreased by $2 million. So overall, for the classroom staffing funding, what we are saying is that would be the yellow line. What we see is an increase of 8.7 million, but really our funding, because of enrollment, is decreasing by 5 million. And the 13.8 million that we're getting, it's really for the compensation change. You can now move to the Learning Resources Fund. So
Chair, there's a question on.
I have a hand there.
Yes.
Trustee Promoli?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. And thank you through you, Chair. Sorry, I just wanted to be clear, going back to, I believe it was the local circumstances staffing allocation. So that included all of our EAs and BEAs, correct?
Through you, Chair. So it includes some, but some of the EAs would be through SNECAD as well. So there's two areas. So the staffing component does provide a small portion, but the majority would be funded elsewhere. So they'll be further down.
Okay. I'm just wondering because I recognize, of course, we do see this decrease in enrollment, but what I'm hearing often from administrators is that while we're seeing enrollment drop, we're not really seeing the number of students who do have these additional needs going down at the same rate. So I was curious about how those allocations are decided, whether it's whether that funding is decided based on overall pupil enrollment or if it comes down to what is recognized as need within the board. So recognizing that we already have a number of students who are identified as exceptional and needing that additional support, does that put us in a place where we already are eligible for the funding that we would need to make sure that we have students, for example, from maybe SK to grade 12 or grade 1 to grade 12, depending on when they would make those decisions? Or is it just solely based on the overall enrollment of the board for these purposes, and then we have to sort of work from there? I don't know if that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, through you, Chair. Yeah, no, that was clear. So the majority of the funding is really through enrollment, including for special education. There is a component that they use to what they call measures of variability that we'll be talking about that does some differentiation. But again, I won't steal the thunder, but you will see there is a component of that there as well that tries to differentiate within the province. So, but yes, there's a component that's strictly on enrollment, which is actually the larger portion, and then there is another portion that has some variability that we'll be discussing a little bit later.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Through each other, there's another question.
Trustee Bay.
Thank you, through the chair. You had mentioned that the COVID-related funding has now been withdrawn from the ministry. So I got a call from the community the other day, and I think this person was running some private programs during COVID based on the funding that was given. So she wanted to know if it will continue, and there are some certain schools in the ward that she lives where she was running the programs that really need that kind of extra support. So I wasn't able to, explain, though I've forwarded it to the associate director. So, but this is once and for all removed. I just want to clarify.
Through you, Chair. So what they consider specific COVID funding, most of it has been discontinued. Like I'm not sure about the program you're referencing, so I think you probably did the right thing about that. Because again, some of them we've incorporated ongoing, depending on what they are. But what is considered truly COVID specific has been discontinued.
Okay, thank you.
Please continue.
So moving on to the Learning Resources Fund. So as Tanya mentioned earlier, the Learning Resources Fund has a balance that's going to be repeated under this funding, except that in this case here, they are staffing costs, but not directly working with the students. For instance, we have our librarians, guidance counselors, consultants, or lunchroom supervisors. And also we have all the learning materials in terms of textbooks, computer technology, etc. So the first and the first and biggest funding under the Learning Resources Fund is also the per pupil amount. So this is also based on the general enrollment. And here, if we look at the amount, similar to the classroom staffing funding, we don't see a big change from one year to the other. We only see $18,000. And if we look at the reason for change, the last two columns, we can see that because enrollment going down, the funding is also going down by 1.1 million. And because of the benchmark changes, there have been an increase in funding of close to the same amount of $1.1 million. I just want to point out here that even though the staffing benchmarks have changed, there have been no changes in terms of the non-staffing items. So moving on to the next allocation, which is the language support and local circumstances. So very similar to the classroom staffing funding, we have the FSL and the ESL. And here it's for the non-staffing cost portion. And also we also have in this one the Q&E, the qualification and experience teachers top up for our teachers and ECEs. And we also have the ELHP funding here, which is the beneficial funding.
Got that, Mark? Okay.
Okay.
Yes, if you can please continue.
So for this funding, if we look at the change from one year to the other, we see the funding going down by $400,000. Even if we look at the split, we see that it's mostly we can see with the in the compensation change, you see in this case there's a little bit of a over, and that's because that's the trust benefit adjustment that the ministry does for us. So moving on to the Indigenous education support allocation from one year to the other, we see a change of $190,000 down. And here we see enrollment change of $74,000. And also in that amount, we also have the lead. And in terms of the compensation change, the minus is because of the updated census. The mental health and student safety, the next two allocation, there hasn't been much changes other than the benchmark changes. One is $58,000, the next one is $28,000, that's mostly the benchmark. The next one is the continuing ed. So for the continuing ed, the current budget is $13.5 million. Going into next year, we're expecting about 16 million. So an increase of 2.4 million. So if we look at the reason for the change, we do see in this case in ConEd, we have seen a bit of enrollment in all the programs that ConEd offer, and that's going to bring us a little bit more money of $1.8 million, but that's technically the more programs we have to run, then we have to correspondingly get the staffing and the associated cost to run these programs. And of course, then in terms of the benchmark, they also, this allocation would also have been updated for any change in benchmarks according to union agreements. Moving on to the next one, this is the school management allocation. So this funding is for our administration of schools and leadership at the school levels. So that would include our principals, vice principals, secretarial staff, as well as school supplies like outside the classroom. So looking at the change from one year to the other, we see an increase of 500,000. And if we look at the reason for the change, we do see a decrease in the funding because of enrollment of $700,000, whereas under the compensation change, we see an increase. And in this case, it's mostly because of the secretarial. In terms of our principals and vice principals, they haven't had any change in agreement yet, so the benchmarks are still the same. So the only benchmark changing here would be for our secretarial. And also included in this funding is the remote learning allocation, and we've seen a decrease actually in the remote learning of 712 students. So accordingly, the funding has been decreased. In the last one of the last allocation of the learning resources fund is the differentiated supports allocation. So similar to the classroom staffing funding, here we have the demographic element, where because of the census update, we've seen a decrease in funding. The portion that's been decreased here is about $800,000, and so that's mostly the change in this allocation. So if we look at the reason for change, we have most of it under the compensation, but really it's really because of the census data, right? It impacted us directly. So moving on to the special education. So from one year to the other, right now the funding is at 227 million. Going into next year, we're expecting 230 million, so an increase of 2.4 million. So looking at the different components of the special education funding, we have the per pupil amount. So similar to what I've mentioned before, it goes by grade and the benchmark for each of the grades. So we can see from one year to the other an increase of 900,000. And if we look at the reason for the change, really it's mostly because of the compensation change, because of the increase in benchmarks, because really in terms of the enrollment change, we are seeing a decrease of $1.7 million. Going to the next one where we have the differentiated needs allocation. So this funding is where the ministry tries to kind of reallocate the funding to be more in line with the needs of school boards, but this will also depend on the census data that we have. In this here, what you see is a decrease of $159,000, and in terms of the split, you actually see an increase in the enrollment change. This is not because of enrollment, but this was the best place for me to put it. But this is where we have the transfer from PPF. So Tanya mentioned that one of the funding actually, which was previously provided for PPF, or now it's called the Responsive Education Program for Professional Assessment, has now been transferred to the core education funding. So that's why you see a positive change under the enrollment column for that allocation. Whereas under the compensation change, you see a negative there, and this is because of the census data being updated. And unfortunately, this has impacted us unfavorably, and offset in that column are any increase in the benchmarks. The next one is the complex supports allocation. So this is where we use called the SIP funding, the special incidents portion. So this is where our students might need extra support in the classroom to operate. And here we can see an increase of $1.7 million. So here, in terms of the SIP funding, the ministry has an interim formula. It used to be we have to send in claims, but for a few years, the ministry has been looking at the historical claims and based on that, and have been providing the funding for the future year as well as an increase in benchmark. So in this particular case, you can see from the enrollment column, you see an increase of 1.7 million. So again, it's not really the enrollment, it's just like the formula itself has been updated with the new benchmarks, giving us additional funding of $1.7 million. And in terms of the benchmark change, we see an increase of $33,000. The last but not least of the special education funding is the specialized equipment allocation. This is the SIA. This is for the individualized equipment that the student might need inside the classroom. So here we see a decrease actually of 185,000. So for this one, I'm just gonna tell a bit more about this one because there has been a change in the formula. So there's two components to that funding. There's the per pupil amount. So irrespective, we used to get an amount for per pupil plus a base amount, and also we have a claim amount, right? For the claim, it used to be we have a $800 deductible per claim, and then anything over and above 800 we could claim, and the minister would give us the money back. Now the rule has changed, so there's no deductible for the claim, but the claim is only going to be for items above $5,000. So what this means is that everything under $5,000 will have to be financed from the per pupil amount. So therefore, correspondingly, what the ministry has done is that they have reviewed the per pupil amount. So it used to be around 36.5 per ADE for the per pupil amount. Now it's 50. I want to say $51. So it has increased by $11 approximately per student. But at the same time, it does mean that we'll have to pay for whatever we were paying before for the per pupil funding and any equipment which costs less than $5,000 in that per pupil amount. So in reality, then when we look at this, the change, really like the first column, which shows the enrollment change, I have included in here the 2 million for the claim, because we look at the claims, and the claim from last year, anything over $5,000 was in the 700, close to, let's say, $1 million. So that's why the claim amount has gone down by 2 million, but then offset by decrease in enrollment. And on the benchmark of the compensation change, we're going up by $1.9 million. I'm gonna stop here, see if we have any questions.
No questions, keep on going.
Through you, Chair. So just maybe, as Trustee Kamali did ask about spec, so just this would be where you would see that the per pupil amount, which is just by enrollment, which is the first line, and then the next line, which is differentiated needs amount, would be trying to look at the variability between our board and other boards. You know, like we can agree whether or not it's correct, but that's where the variability sets in. And as Codra mentioned, some of the other ones used to be claim based, which was the complex supports allocation, but they again have allowed us to kind of project what our needs are rather than us having to do claims.
So if I look at, our numbers went up 2.3 million, but to me it seems our funding per pupil has gone down.
Right.
And we always, let's just equate this to what it is. I mean, we're always hearing we need more EAs. So I understand our funding's down.
Yeah.
In this.
Through you, Chair. So if we look at the overall spec ed funding, so even though when you compare amount to amount, yes, it's gone up by 2.3 million, but as far as the compensation go, which we have to automatically pay to staff, is gone up by almost 4 million. So in fact, our funding is gone down by $1.6 million.
Right.
Just yeah.
Right. Which
yeah, I think yeah,
which I won't agree. It's not good.
No.
We're going to come to these questions later. I just wanted to highlight this. This is the one that glared out at me the most. But anyway,
so
Jill and Trustee Kamali, and we'll have Lucas on houses up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah, so one of the challenges that we've been having in my wards is that we do have quite a number of students who are asylum seeking, and so we are. What I'm hearing from a number of my schools is that they are having challenges finding the supports that they need when it comes to additional support in terms of EAs, BEAs, and I'm curious if the funding would come, like which bucket funding would come out of for this, and how we allocate for that when it's sort of a variable support that's a little bit harder to plan for, because these are students who we can't necessarily plan for 6 months or a year in advance, because their lives are in flux as they're kind of coming and going through our region. They may be here for a while. They may be here for a short time, but those needs are there, and the schools really do need the support. So I'm curious how we allocate as a board to make sure that we are able to fund the supports that need to be put in place, but also how we plan for those, and then how we ensure that we can put those supports in place so that the schools are able to provide the support that those students need, and so that the school can function well, not just for those students who do need the additional support, but for their classes, for the school as a whole. And I recognize that's a large question, but in terms of budgeting, I'm curious if there is a space for sort of that variable need that is something that isn't necessarily something that we can plan for in a strict way, the way that we normally could with students who are permanent residents that have been registered for some time, but are part of our community for some time or maybe for a long time.
Through you, Chair. So I'll start. And so first of all, I guess those are some of the challenges that a lot across the province are similar, especially in the GTA. And so I think the ministry and some of its funding, so it's by enrollment. So that I think the view partly is that as your enrollment goes down, there is some component that should also go down with some of those. And I think they look to boards to prioritize and look at ways to manage within their funding. And so again, across the province, boards struggle with managing within the spec envelope. Some do it better than others, and some provide different services. But really, it is a challenge. But I think right now, when you're the bucket it would come out of would be within the per pupil amount. Typically, but as was mentioned, that amount's going down because our enrollment's going down. So I think through the budget process, those are going to be critical questions, because that will be looking at what, our current enrollment that's remaining, how do you reallocate or how do you manage? And I think you're mentioning new needs, so that's going to be an additional challenge.
Okay, and thank you. And through you, Chair, I do want to flag that, in some situations we are at times seeing up to 100 students who are asylum seeking at a single school at a time, and that requires significant support. And these are students who have been through, some of them, incredible trauma, and they do need support, and we recognize it. But these are students who also sometimes they don't have an OHIP card. They don't have access to a diagnosis. They don't have any of those traditional things that we have in place to ensure that students have access to the additional support that we will put in place. But the schools need these supports in place so that they can function and operate properly for all the students in the school, including these students who are going through trauma and have relocated into our region, again, either for a short time or a long time. So I just want to flag that as we're going through the budget process right now, is that right now Peel has our shelters. Oh, sorry, I froze for a second. Our shelters are at 400% capacity. So enrollment may be down, but our needs are quite high at the moment. So that may be something we need to keep in mind if there's a way that we can be mindful of that as we're working forward. Anyway, thank you. I appreciate it.
So Trustee Alves, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, through you. Looking at the Special Education Fund as the example. So COO Jespal Gill noted correctly, we see 3.981 million in change go to the compensation change, leaving us with a $1.618 million shortfall. As it relates to headcount per pupil, do we know what the cost, do we know the number per pupil that we're getting in terms of funding? And then maybe we can look at that number and say, per pupil, this is what it's dropped. I think, Brad, you were alluding to something similar, that we might be seeing a trend that we're getting less per pupil. But the number I'm curious to know is, what are we getting less per pupil? And then what are we getting less per pupil versus what it should be by inflation?
Maybe I'll jump into that. Normally we provide, per pupil funding and compare it to other boards. And we use that in the category of special education as well as just regular stuff. So I'll just
I can start to reach her. So So per pupil, generally, a lot of what we're looking at right now is per pupil, and just when we're talking about benchmark increases, that's where the ministry tries to incorporate some of that inflationary, which would be generally compensation at the school level. So that's not additive, but it's simply inflationary due to salary needs. So again, if you can look at the compensation changes, you could view that as those are the pressures, collective agreements that they've had to increase people's salary. So as mentioned, there have not been a lot of other increases in terms of inflationary amounts. However, in the school operations, which we'll again talk about in a minute, there's been about 2%. So again, that doesn't mean that it's meeting our inflationary needs. So again, when looking at overall per pupil, we haven't calculated it as yet, but you would take all those amounts and basically divide by our students. But you will look like it's increasing because there's a lot of compensation changes that will be built into that number now because they are funding us for the changes. And if you will recall that our compensation, our salary is about 82% of our budget. So certainly that piece is built in.
And I think that's one of the things the government will say, oh, we've increased funding, look at it, we put $10 trillion more. It's well, you're paying more salaries. That's about it. You haven't introduced any new money or initiatives. Now we'll wait till we go through this and figure that statement out, but that's traditionally what they've said. Trustee Allison, it's really just, oh, you've settled more money for salaries, you've given inflationary, but not enough, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, you have another follow-up question? Trustee
Yes,
Allison?
sorry, through you, Chair. So my endpoint, and I don't expect an answer immediately. I think that staff might have to take this back and do some math here, but the point I'm trying to make, you're kind of describing. I would like to know if staff could provide us with the number. So whatever the number is we're getting gross per pupil, and then I'd like to know how much that's gone up or down, removed from compensation. So to your point, the ministry is undoubtedly going to come back and say, look, we had this big spending budget. We gave you 3.9 $4 million more for funding in any XYZ portfolio. And I want to be able to say, no, that covered obligations that are mandatory to be paid for salary through union negotiation. I want to know what are the shortfalls or increases based on actual funding after we've paid staff. I think that number might be useful to us to go back, and whether it's a letter or what have you, to the ministry to say, hey, now that you've taken care of legal obligations, contractual obligations, what's our shortfall per head? But that's the end of my questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And I assume that'll come later when we get closer to the budget being completed. Anyway, thank you. Please continue. I don't see any other questions.
Okay. So the next funding is the school facilities funding. So this funding is to operate our schools in terms of cleaning and utilities, that kind of items. So if we look from one year to the other, we see just a small increase of $210,000. And let's look at the allocation. The main allocation is school operations allocation. That's how they englobe everything. So that would include staffing costs and non-staffing costs. So in here, the way the funding works is that the ministry determines a square footage by elementary student and secondary student. And therefore, based on this square footage, then we'll allocate funding, benchmarking inside the square footage that we're going to be using. So, of course, then with decreasing enrollment, that square footage goes down, and therefore we see the enrollment change in the first column of $1.9 million, and offset by any change in the benchmark in the next column of $2.1 million. Again, this benchmark change is really just to pay for the staff. And here the good news is the ministry did give 2% for inflationary purposes. So that only happened in this funding here. So, but overall, when we look at the change, it's only 200,000, and the enrollment change is $1.9 million. Moving on to the student transportation funding. So here we see for the current year, the funding is $56 million, and going into next year, $69 million. So the increase is close to $13 million. So that's good news. The different elements, and the main element is the transportation services allocation. So as Tanya mentioned earlier, there has been a change in the formula of this funding, or looking at the number of routes that the school boards have. And the good news is the minister recognized the routes for our regional programs. So that kind of brought us more funding. And there's different elements in the transportation funding. There's the vehicle element, the fuel element, drivers, and the contract. The new one is the contracted special purpose vehicle. So only for the contracted special purpose vehicle, the board got $1.7 million. And for the new routes, it directly impacted the vehicle and fuel amount and the drivers by $5.8 million. Although in terms of the census, because there's an element of census in here for what they call local priorities, we did see a change of $1.9 billion, $1.9 million down. But everything together, one net off against the other, the net change is $30 million.
So can I jump in there? So this is $13 million we didn't have last year that we're getting new this year for doing the same service. Okay.
Not through each year.
Other than some inflationary.
So not, well, yes and no, not exactly. So when we provided the routing to the ministry, it is with the expectation that we would implement transportation to regional programs, which we currently do not. So first of all, the first thing is we were already over in our transportation between our expenses and funding. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is we have to implement routes in order to for this funding to come to us, because we had said to them, like, so what you would do is you submit the routing, and within the routing we had indicated that we were doing or we were planning to do the regional program. So in order to get that funding, that's what we have to implement.
So this is money available.
Right.
We change the routing now. There's two. I remember from last year we had there's different busing distances. That's one of them, and then there's now you're saying regional programs. Regional programs. So then that now fund all regional programs.
We have submitted that, so I don't know what that is.
So if you can explain that.
So the way the new funding formula works is that ministry expects the school boards to submit their routing for each year, so they do, and then the ministry reviews it, and then based on that they will move. Yeah, we agree with this routing. So for next school year, staff has included the routing for regional programs as well. So they recognize that, and they said, okay, we will fund you for that. So if we don't, as the board, we don't use those routing. And then obviously the ministry will say, you're not doing it, so we will claw back on your funding.
So this is good news.
Yes.
So we have the first good news I've heard here in the budget.
Yes.
So let me understand for everyone who may be listening, regional programs will be
passed.
So what would those programs be? So we already. Okay, so I'll just use French immersion as a good example. We will bus.
That's not a regional program.
I know.
Okay.
Okay. That's why I'm using the complicated one first. We bus elementary, we bus middle school, we bus extended French, we bus in Caledon, right? French high school.
Yes.
But we don't do any French high school in Brampton, Mississauga. And so that would not be covered under this.
Those readings would not be part of this.
Okay, good. And then all the other programs, arts, sci-tech, all those could be. So that would be a real big game changer, wouldn't it? For a lot of our families who want to know about flying and can't drive their children.
Yeah.
Or also now we not have to drive the children and lining up huge parking lot, kiss and rides to drop off all the kids for the regional programs.
Yeah.
Okay,
So, to you, Chair, can I clarify? So there is a report coming to your PPF3
okay,
next month. It will outline the details of the transportation to regional programs. And so it will have the details in it, what will be implemented comes the September 20.
okay. So stay tuned to the next PPB with Chair Cameron is running that. Now, you're saying we have to submit this to the government. We're approving the budget July 2nd. We submit it and wait, hope, or
The funding has been already allocated.
so
If we just don't use it, then it'll be.
okay, I got you.
Otherwise, funding is there.
Okay, so great news. Thank you.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Sorry. So, Scarlett, did you have a question?
I did,
Trustee?
you can go first.
Okay, Trustee Benjamin.
So when we talked about regional programs and you mentioned, I have an email from a parent who's asking whether IB programs, they were promised something, but now it's not happening. So would that be included for transportation?
So first of all, through you, Chair, I'm not sure what was promised. So the one aspect of me, I should speak there with, I think we'll wait for that vote to come and have a conversation on the regional transportation. But as far as the transportation goes, it will go to all regional programs, which includes IB program.
Okay, thank you.
Great news.
That's good.
Excited. I Trustee Bailey, you have something else?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. So through you, Chair, this was more of a curiosity thing. When you went back to under facilities funding, it's only a minuscule amount, but we get funded for rural, well, we used to get funded for rural and northern education, we'll get $10,000.
Through you, Chair, yes, so again, and that's why it's a minuscule amount, because we have urban centers, but I think some of the Cal done when they were doing distances, but that amount is shrinking as things are spreading out and getting closer, so then even that's changing. What they do is they look at census and see which students live in certain proximity to an urban center, and that's how they derive it. So obviously some of the northern boards, like when we talk about why do some boards get more monies, that would be an area, for example, a northern board get more money because they would have a lot more funding to that, because they would look at more costs to transport students, supplies, getting up there and all those kind of things.
Okay, I have David in the back. Yes.
Through you, Chair, for the question, please. The busing for regional programs, is that something that's unique to our board, or is it something that our coterminous board might also be getting?
Not sure what through you, Chair, not sure what the plans are for the coterminous board, but it's definitely for us that we are moving forward.
Sorry, I thought your staff. So who are you?
It's Kimberly Jones passed.
And you're part of the field?
The Principals Association.
Oh, Principal Association, sorry, I didn't.
Principal West Credit.
Right, yeah, sorry, Paul. I'm just not recognizing you in your school. So, yeah, thank you.
I think we do have a trustee.
Okay, and do we have trustee Pomola put in her?
Hi, Kimberly. So through you, Chair, first of all, Chair McDonald, I'm glad that you brought up French immersion, because I did actually have a question about that also. I am curious why we don't bus for French immersion when for many students that can be a significant distance away from their home to go to their French immersion school to continue in their stream of learning. And I am curious why we wouldn't, because if students within Mississauga and Brampton happened to be outside of 3.9 kilometers from their school in just regular stream, we would bus them, correct? Is that correct?
So through the Chair, I think the French program we do for the elementary, we do bus them, but beyond that, it's considered an optional program, and a result of that, we do not for those programs. But the intent is that we're going to continue to work with the ministry to see if in future year they will also allow us, as they are allowing us for regional, whether they will also allow us for our secondary or extended French or those programs to bus them in Mississauga and Brampton as well. So that's our plan. We will continue to work with the ministry on that.
Okay, yeah.
But we do need the funding for that. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And again, through you, Chair, I do think that is something that's important for us to consider, because I think there are students who would likely opt out of continuing in their French stream in secondary just because it is quite a further distance. And I have had parents reaching out just in recent weeks because they had expected that their students would be bused to their French immersion high school, but they actually live quite far away. And so they're unsure how their students are expected to get to secondary school to continue in their chosen studies. And I think that's important for us to consider, because that is a stream, and they do have the right to pursue their education in French. And especially now that we have opened this door to busing for regional programming, and I think it's fantastic, because I think it's such a great step towards making sure that more students can access the programs that are available. Although I think also all of our schools are fantastic, every single one of them. But I would like to make sure that we are doing what we can to enable students to continue in French immersion if that's the stream that they are already studying in. So anyway, I was curious, why we hadn't gone in that direction. I was surprised about it, actually. So, okay, thank you.
If you want some history, it's we haven't been doing that except for Caledon on a motion about, I don't know, 6-8 years ago. We haven't done it. We couldn't afford that amount of money. It was a significant amount of money. That was when our board had surplus in the sales. Now it's very difficult in our declining board. So it carries a cost to it. And especially when 21 years ago, we were overspent, I think, in our transportation, $20 million or $40 million. It was a huge number. And certainly we're much closer to our cost. And that brings up a question: are we funded for our transportation costs?
Through you, Chair. So once all the costs are, we'll let you know. So right now it looks like we'd be funded, but we'll have to look at all the costs in terms of the original programs, and we'll get back to you.
Good, thank you. Okay, let's carry on. Sorry, another question on page 22, Molly?
Sorry, Chair. Just one more thing. I want to ensure that we are doing what we can to ensure that we continue to have busing in place for West Credit and Judith Nyman, because they are unique programs within our board, especially as they are schools that don't have a catchment. And I know that making sure that we have that busing. So now that we have the new funding in place from the Ministry for Regional Programs, do West Credit and Judith Nyman fall within that bucket, or is that something that's different?
Through you, Chair, we had made the commitment that we will continue to bus those for those two programs. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Good. Let's carry on.
Okay, thank you. So the last funding that we see here is the School Board Administration Fund. So this is the funding at the board level, where we see the trustees, the director's office, as well as all the departments, the finance, payroll, HR, and LTSS. So the first allocation here is the trustee and parent engagement allocation. So here we see a slight increase of $5,000, and that's mostly because we added a student trustee. The next allocation is the board-based staffing allocation. So this will be for staffing at the board level. And here we see a slight, it's $165,000, and mostly it's to do with the benchmark changes. Because even for our board staff, like some of us are unionized, some are not, but the provision the ministry has asked to do 1.25% for non-unionized staff as well. The next one is the Central Employer Bargaining Agency fee allocation. So this is really just an in and out. We've seen a slight increase of $400. And the data management and audit allocation. So some of the audit expenses, reporting entity type of expenses. So just the slight changes in benchmark resulting in $1,500 increase from one year to the other. Last but not least, on the allocation, under the school board admin is the declining enrollment adjustment. So the administrators recognize that our enrollment is still declining. So, and that, we are expected to adjust our cost because the logic is less students, less cost. But they do understand that not all adjustments can be made overnight. So they do have boards to, with the declining enrollment allocation until we can adjust our cost to have a balanced budget, which is the requirement.
So I think we've come to the end of all our numbers. So I'm just there's only one more slide. So as you will know, just before I go off the slide, so in our compensation change, we have about 34 million, and our enrollment change, we have about 7. Oops. So as we go forward, just things to consider. Again, and I think we tried to point them as we were going through. So again, there was lots of numbers, and as you saw when we did them net, some of them netted to very minimal. But if you look at the declining across in terms of enrollment, it's about 7.1 million. In terms of compensation or other changes, we have about 34.5 million. And again, these are really spoken for. That's why we put them in that column. And then we look at things that have been transferred again. So again, built in within some of those numbers, there's about 400,000 that was mentioned around moving from the responsive education program, which had been a separate type of fund, to within this funding. We talked about the removal of the COVID funding, which is about 832, which was actually within that number. And as mentioned, we did have an impact in the change of the census and the use of the low household income measure, which is again a decrease of about 2 million. And on top of that, there's some other restrictions on some of the new funding that require specific spending that we did mention, and there's some that we didn't, but there's lots of different restrictions. But so these are things to consider. So before I turn it over, I also want to thank all my staff. Some of them are online and some of them are here who helped kind of put all this together. There's been a lot of work, especially in this transition, you're trying to splice all this apart and bring it to you. So with that, we'll take any other further questions that you may have.
Yes, I see Trustee Alves online.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one more question, and so I lost that last slide. The last slide has now disappeared. The decline in funding across all funding allocations for 7.1 million. Is that inclusive of the is that just like a brute cost inclusive of the compensation change, or is that without counting the compensation? We lost 7.1 million per student, or for 4 students.
Through you, Chair, that's a great question. So when we do these type of variants, and we call a volume and price, this is strictly volume. So which means that is just for enrollment. We did not include any aspects to do with any of the compensation changes.
Perfect, got it. So the shortfall is 7.1 million. That's a lot.
Through you, Chair. So even though the ministry will say that the board is getting $27 million extra next year, but really, if you look at it, we have to provide to staff $34.5 million. If you look at it that way, technically, we are getting $7 million less. So just so that's where we are sort of coming from.
And that means the cost side, you're going to have to find $7 million.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, Trustee Bailey.
Through you, Chair. I want to say, thank you for breaking it down in digestible content that we're able to understand, because I'm pretty sure that in the method that you guys get it, in which we look at it and completely lost, and being able to present it in a manner in which we can understand what we've actually lost, because $7.1 million is a lot of money. It's a lot of money to make up. So thank you for that.
Great. Seeing no other questions, do I have someone who put the receipt of this oral report on the floor? Trustee Bailey, second by trustee Benjamin, all those in, or, do I see no, all those in favor of, this oral report, put your hands up, so be passed, and now we're on zoning reports, so there's no communication, no trustee notice of motion, no, notices of motion, so we're down to the last item. Trustee Bailey, puts it on the floor adjournment, trustee, Joe Hall will second it, all those in favor, the meeting is adjourned, thank you so much, everyone.